with the greatest living authority on Islam in the Near East. Many of you know Professor Bernard Lewis, some of you more, some of you less, but just in the name of getting through formalities as quickly as possible, let me just share with you that Professor Lewis is recognized as perhaps the world's leading authority in Islam today. He's authored some 30 books and hundreds of articles. I even think more than 1,000 articles. I was doing the math today, Bernard. And length, you haven't counted? So just go to Google. If you go to Google, it's kind of like going into Professor Lewis's home. It's amazing. Thousands and thousands of sources written over the last 70 years of professional life, thinking about the tough questions that Islam poses and the Arab world poses to all of us and to itself. And I must tell you that between 1941 and 1945, Professor Lewis served in Her Majesty's Service, British Intelligence Agency's Middle East Desk. From 74 to 76, he was the Cleveland Dodge Professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton. And of course, many of you know him for his best-selling books, Crisis of Islam and What Went Wrong, which have been translated into some 20-some-odd languages, including Farsi and Indonesian. Professor Lewis, what we've seen on the emergence of the communications revolution in Arab countries are a lot of brave attempts, one might call them, to criticize regimes on television, yes, in newspapers, and on the internet. Why is that happening now, and what's the prospect for that type of opposition? Is that Muslim Brother opposition? Is that, can one argue that there are democracy and freedom oppositionaires as well?
Yeah. The communications revolution has had a tremendous impact. In the past, the Muslim world was, on the whole, I would say, rather better situated than the Western world regarding communication. Even in the pre-modern era, the annual pilgrimage, which brought Muslims together from all over the Muslim world, gave them a feeling of common identity and common awareness without parallel in the Western world until comparatively modern times. The mosque, the minaret, the preacher gave them a medium of communication free from censorship, and again with a wide impact without parallel in the pre-modern Western world. With the advent of modern communications, all that has changed. Now they have even more than that on a much vaster scale. Radio, television, internet, and the rest of it now operating on a vast scale all over the Islamic world, including, and this is the part that I find both interesting and encouraging, including Iran. And there is growing evidence that a large part, probably the majority of the population in Iran, are thoroughly fed up with the regime that rules them. This appears in a number of ways, partly through websites, through communication directly by telephone, and in other ways. It's well expressed in what is probably the most reliable indicator of political trends in the Middle East, generally in autocratic regimes, the political joke. Let me give you a couple of examples from Iran. Two Iranians are discussing how dreadful the situation is in their country. This is bad, that's worse, this is terrible, that's awful. And finally one says to the other, what we need in this country is to bring Osama bin Laden here. And the other one turns to him in horror and said, what, are you crazy? And the first one said, no, then the Americans would come. Now that is an authentic Iranian joke communicated from Iran. It tells you something. Another one, at the time when President Bush launched his attack on Iraq, a lot of people telephoned from Iran to say, you should have tackled your problems in alphabetical order.
By the way, in the first reorganization of the Arab world, you coined a phrase for what happened in Kuwait when Iraq conquered that country. What did you call it?
Really?
You won't get out of this. Right? Do you remember what you said? What did you say?
I said that the operation should be renamed. Instead of Desert Storm, it should be called Coetus Interruptus.
Now that's a positive note.
Hey, what about Barack Obama? We want to hear about that.
I want to
My specialty is the Middle East, not the Middle West.
But this means something for Israel. What you've said here, and I don't want to let this slip, is that if Israel is being sought after, in a sense, by the Arab world, what does that mean about Israel's own perception of itself in terms of being a regional player as opposed to a bilateral player against the Palestinians, which has been the definition, its own self-definition, very much so until today?
I think Israel needs to redefine itself in accordance with contemporary realities.
Which means?
That's for Israelis to decide.
How about the longer view, Bernard? You know, let me just mention something. That you've written some 30 books, and for some reason, for some good reason, you've just written a book. It's just sort of hot off the press, if you will, with a dear friend of many, many years and a colleague, Bunsie Ellis Churchill, who is here. Bunsie, just raise your hand so everyone says hello. And this book is called Islam, the Religion and the People. Now, this book comes probably before you've hit your sweet spot in your career, Bernard. You have another 30 or 40 or 50 years, we're sure. But the question is, why the focus on this book now on the religion of Islam, which is where you focused your attention?
Because Islam is very much the topic of the moment. We are dealing with this revolutionary movement in Iran, which defines itself and is indeed defined as an Islamic movement. That's to say, with a challenge to the whole world of Islam. We are in a time when Islam is challenging the Western world in a way that it hasn't done since the early Middle Ages. Remember that in the perception of Muslims at the present day, and of the Western world in earlier times, but no longer today, there has been a cosmic struggle going on for centuries and indeed for a couple of millennia between the two world religions, Christianity and Islam. A struggle that has gone backwards and forwards. The Muslims came out of Arabia and invaded and conquered a large part of the Christian world. The Middle East, North Africa, all parts of Christendom then, and then into Europe, southern Italy, Spain, Portugal, a bit of France. But Europe reacted, drove them back. Second attempt, the Ottomans. They conquered Anatolia, which was then a Christian land, Constantinople, which was then a Christian city, invaded the Balkan Peninsula, conquered all of it, and advanced twice as far as Vienna. And again they were driven back. But then, like the Arabs in North Africa, they retained part of their conquests, but lost most of Europe. Many people in the Muslim world see this as, shall we say, third time lucky. The third, and as they hope, the final attempt by the Muslims to bring their holy war into the land of the unbelievers, and after two partly but not finally successful attempts to complete the job. And in that context, we see what is happening in Europe as an essential phase of that. And through the double factors of demography and migration, certainly the progress of Islam in Europe, helped by the willingness of so many Europeans to submit, is making impressive progress.
What you wrote in 1990, a watershed article called The Roots of Muslim Rage. Now, it was just 36 months before the first World Trade Center attack. And the question of the roots of Muslim rage, how do we understand it today? Is it modernity? Is it Christianity? Is it Christendom, as it were? And how should the West respond to that rage?
I think one thing is important to point out, that in the Muslim world, particularly in the Arab world, they have a very strong sense of history, a very strong awareness of history, without parallel in the modern West. Probably you're better situated here In America, the ignorance of history is quite appalling. If you say that's history, you mean it's finished, over and done with, and of no current importance. And from time to time, as I say, one is appalled at the level of ignorance even among university students. Now, in the Muslim world generally, they have a very strong sense of history. That doesn't mean to say that their history is necessarily very accurate. That's not the point. But there is this strong awareness. For example, during the 8-year war that was fought between Iraq and Iran, two Muslim countries, both carried on extensive propaganda addressed to their own people and to the enemy populations. And the propaganda from both sides was full of historical allusions. And I mean allusions. They didn't tell stories from history. They would mention a name, a date, a place from 14 centuries ago, in the certain awareness that these references would be picked up and understood. Now, I can't imagine that happening in Europe at the present time. It does happen there. This sense of awareness is very important, and I think it's very much in evidence of the present time. They talk of the first attempt when they made progress and were driven back. They talk of the second attempt when they made progress and were driven back, and now the third. Well, what's the difference now? Each time they were driven back by some new European force. The Byzantines, the European empires. In the modern period, they confronted two rival powers in the world of the unbelievers, which means the world of non-Islam. Osama bin Laden puts it very clearly and very eloquently in his writings that this struggle has been going on for more than 13 centuries. The Islamic world was ruled by successive dynasties of caliphs from successive capitals: Medina, Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, Istanbul. The world of the unbelievers was ruled by successive emperors or equivalent from various capitals. In the final phase, he says, the world of the unbelievers was divided, disputed between two rival superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. In Afghanistan, he says, we, meaning the Muslims, we defeated and destroyed the more deadly and the more dangerous of the two. Dealing with the Americans will be comparatively simple and comparatively easy. This is the perception which I think motivates the jihadists of the present time. The feeling that this is the final phase of the millennial struggle. They have defeated one of the final two superpowers. They are driving back the other. They are taking over Europe, and the next step is to take over the rest of the world. This outlook is very clearly expressed, and it is linked with the millennial apocalyptic view which I mentioned earlier.
Then let's look at the symmetrical case in the West. The West's experience in the Middle East has not really been all that positive since 1979. In other words, attempts to confront, approach Islam, radical Islam, have not succeeded. Why is that, and what's missing in the analysis of the West?
Well, I think the first thing that's missing in the analysis is an awareness of what we confront, and a more accurate perception of what is happening, of what the different forces are within the Islamic world, I think would be a helpful beginning. The second, I think, is a lack of awareness of the magnitude of the threat. A tendency to see this in old-fashioned terms as some sort of colonial war or some local trouble. It isn't. It's much more than that.
Professor Lewis, let me go back to Iran for a moment and talk about Iranian imperialism and its use of genocidal talk of incitement against Israel in the context of its desire for and its intention to achieve regional supremacy. Can we say, what is the role, let's say, of genocide within Iran's imperial designs? Can it be compared to some sort of Nazi behavior in the past?
Well, genocide is not part of the Muslim scenario for the end of time. Yes, there will be final struggles against Jews and Christians and other non-Muslims, but this kind of genocidal approach I don't think has precedence in the earlier period. What we do find, certainly there's no lack of negative or anti-Jewish traditions of the Prophet, and there are various passages in the Quran, traditions which can be cited to that effect. But this is a new one, and I think is obviously connected with the existence of the State of Israel.
And to begin to wind down here, you have given us some reason for worry tonight, some concern. There's concern in the air.
Yes.
Now, having said that, you have been a proponent of some optimistic assessments with some historical precedent about democracy and freedom in the Arab world.
Yes.
Where are we today in terms of the mix of optimism and pessimism of Professor Lewis when it comes to the possibility of democracy and freedom in the Arab world?
Well, I mentioned before what I call the Sadat Gambit. That's to say, of some rulers in the Middle East deciding to make peace and even seeking some sort of relationship with Israel because they fear a greater danger, which led to the peace treaties with Egypt, with Jordan, and to less formal relations with some other Arab states. That is what is happening now. That is which may affect even as improbable a country as Saudi Arabia, which seems to be looking for, shall we say, some measure of understanding. That leads to cold peace, which is better than no peace, but it's uncertain, and one never knows where it will go. The other thing which I see as more hopeful is what I'm tempted to call the Sharansky effect. The spread of the idea of democracy in our own Western form of it to places where previously it would have been inconceivable. It is still small scale, it is limited, and for obvious reasons it is very dangerous to express. But there are signs. We find people like Mithal al-Alusi in Iraq, who suffered a terrible loss. His children were killed because he visited Israel. Nevertheless, he continues to speak of the need for good relations with Israel and holds up Israel as an example of functioning democracy. And there are others too, in other Muslim countries, in other Arab countries besides Iraq. They are not many, and for obvious reasons they don't speak out very often. They'd have to be very careful, but they do exist. I know some of them, I've spoken with some of them, sometimes in their own countries, sometimes when traveling, sometimes by telephone. There are various ways. It's still limited, it's precarious, but it's happening. And that, I think, is probably the best hope for the future, because these people, and there are a number of them, are very appreciative of Israel. I've sat with people watching Israeli television in Arab countries, and they see an Arab member of parliament stand up in parliament, denounce the government, its members, its policies and its actions, and then go home safely. They see this happening in Israel and shown on Israeli television. The impact of this is enormous. This is something beyond their experience, and it really does have an effect. I remember once an Arab boy who must have been about 12 or 13 years old had his wrist broken by an Israeli soldier or policeman, and he appeared next day with his wrist bandaged, denouncing Israeli brutality on Israeli television. I was watching this in Jordan. With me was an Iraqi. That was when Saddam Hussein was still in power. An Iraqi who had fled from Iraq to Jordan. And he looked at this in utter bewilderment and said, "Wallahi," he said, "I would gladly let Saddam Hussein break both my arms and both my legs if he would let me talk like that on television." These people are not stupid, they see it. Another example comes to mind. When Sadat came to Jerusalem and gave his famous speech to the Knesset. He was accompanied by 2 Egyptian guards with him all the time. When Sadat spoke, the Knesset was absolutely silent. You could hear a pin drop. When he finished and Begin spoke, the Knesset reverted to its normal behavior. Telephone calls, cat calls, conversations, interruptions, people coming and going. A friend of mine was standing next to the 2 Egyptian guards who looked at this in utter bewilderment. And one said to the other, I'll give it to you in Egyptian Arabic for those of you who understand. One said to the other, Da'ida, what is this? And the first one said, Demokratiya, this is democracy. And the first one said, Wallahi haga hilwa awi, a very sweet thing.
There's nothing else to say after that. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Professor Bernard Lewis. That was wonderful, Bernard. Sensational.